Hi, I'm Norman Kunc,
And I'm Emma Vanderclift.
and we're really delighted that you've asked us to speak at your conference.
All right, so let's talk about how we're going to do this. Typically, when Norm and I present together, we take turns, and we're going to do the same thing in this particular video version of something that we usually do live. And so sometimes Norm will be speaking, and then other times I will, and sometimes we might even interrupt each other because that's the downside of presenting with your significant other. So we hope you'll bear with us.
And by the way, for you observant ones who really get committed to looking at continuity in future films, you'll notice my hair changes in different sections of the film. That's because we shot different sections of this video before and after my COVID haircut, just so you know. So we hope you enjoy this. Here we go. So I thought I'd start off by giving you a bit more detailed description of my background. Emma and I believe that it's important that you know the people who are presenting to you as people. Otherwise, the ideas that we put forward sort of hang in the air. Whereas if you know us, you can understand where those ideas came from. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I went to segregated school for disabled kids up to 13, and at that time I argued myself into regular junior high school in my neighborhood. Now at that time there were no models for inclusion or integration, so for me it came down to basic problem solving. How do I take notes in class? How do I do math on typewriter? I took all the subjects. I did, phys ed, math, shop. Yes, you heard me right. I did 4 years of shop, and in case you're wondering, yes, I still have all my fingers. My shop teacher became an alcoholic, but I'm fine. After that, I went into regular high school and moved on there to an undergrad in humanities and master's degree in family therapy. While I was in my undergrad, I wrote a book to document some of the hacks I came up with so I could participate in a regular school, and that book got published. So when my master's finished, I already had a career speaking to educators. And at that point, I had to figure out, do I take the safe, ordinary job as a family therapist, or do I take this more romantic job as a public speaker? I figured, I'll do public speaking for 1 year, and if I don't starve, I'll keep doing it. So here I am. I didn't starve.
Okay, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of who I am, but I'm not doing it right now, and there's a reason for that. That will become evident as we go along. So I'm just going to dive right in and start with the first part of our presentation. You're going to see some PowerPoints up on the screen, and sometimes you'll see our faces again. So here goes. There's an old joke that we heard is also a Sufi parable, and it goes like this. One night, a cop is walking his beat in a very, very dark part of town. And he looks around, and underneath the street light, there's a man. And the man is down on his hands and knees, seems to be looking for something. So the policeman goes up to him and says, "What are you doing?" And the guy says, "Well, I lost my keys." And the cop says, "Well, where'd you lose them?" And he says, "Well, I lost them over there," and points away from the street light. So the policeman looks at him confused and says, "Well, if you lost them over there, why are you looking over here?" And the man said, "Well, the light's better over here." We believe that this is what we've been doing in early childhood education and in inclusive education, and even beyond when it comes to kids with disabilities. We've often been looking where we believe the light is best, where there's evidence-based material, etc. We've gone to the experts. We'd like to suggest that we may have lost those keys somewhere else, and what we really need to do is to take out our flashlights, Nancy Drew style, and look for those keys in other places. So here's what we mean by that. Typically, when we've thought about education, whether it's early childhood education or school-age education, we've had an idea about how we need to deliver our services, and it looks like this. We fundamentally believe that we need first to teach kids skills, and then they will belong in the community. And at first glance, that seems to make common sense. You know, when you know more things, then you're better able to fit in. So essentially, teach those skills, and then you can belong. So in other words, what we see is that we need to create and foster ability before people have the opportunity. We've done that in schools, we've done that in adult programs, and we've done that in early childhood education. Learn the skills, and then you can belong. So ability comes first, followed by opportunity. Seems to make logical sense, doesn't it? So what we like to do is just challenge that idea a little bit. So what I would like you to do is take a couple of minutes and think of 4 classical musicians. Any 4. Got that? Okay. Now I want you to take a moment and think about 4 famous painters. Now, if you are like other audiences that we have asked this question of, you probably thought of people like Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, Bach. And in terms of painters, maybe you thought about Picasso, Matisse, Renoir, and Van Gogh. And yes, it is Van Gogh. I'm Dutch. I know these things. And that's what most people say. When you look at these people, what do you notice? Well, again, if you're like other audiences that we've presented this to, and if you were here, maybe you would say it out loud, they're all men. And I might go on to add, they're all white men. So does that mean for the last 400 years, women and people of color have been completely devoid of artistic or musical ability? Of course it doesn't. What that tells us is that women and people of color were never allowed in. So in other words, they were never given the opportunity. So what we believe is that social convention, not ability, actually determines opportunity. Over to you.
So, as a counterpoint to what you've typically and possibly learned in all your education classes and your professors and instructors, we're going to suggest that we probably got it backwards. We believe that what we need to do, flip it around, is that you put people into the community with support, obviously, and that provides the precursor for that kid or person learning skills. So like I said, we've looked where the light is brightest, and where the light shines down is on ability and skills. What we're suggesting is the real answer may be away from the bright light. It may be around opportunity. So if you look at the traditional model with special education, I think it comes down to this. Segregated special education, or any type of segregation, fundamentally relies on working on ability first, believing that that will lead to opportunity. The fundamental difference in inclusive education lies not in simply putting kids in regular classes with other kids, but it's a recognition that when we do that, we're fostering opportunity that then leads to ability. And to illustrate this in a bit more detail, I want to talk about one of my favorite topics, me. And what I want to do is give you one example in my life where it was dead clear that opportunity had to come before ability. When I was in segregated school, twice a week for a half hour each time, I went to speech therapy. Now, for those of you who never have had speech therapy, what you do is you sit in a little room and read a book out loud. But you can't read the book in your ordinary voice. Nope. You have to read the book in your speech therapy voice. And when you speak in your speech therapy voice, you have to inhale, swallow, and articulate. And you have to do it in that order or else you'll choke yourself. And I would spend 30 minutes reading my book in my speech therapy voice. And then I would leave the speech therapy room and talk the way I usually talk, because everyone could understand me. Well, this went on for several years, and then when I wanted to go to regular school, my speech therapist said, "Norm, you can't go to regular school. You made so much progress. If you quit speech therapy now, you may never get the opportunity to talk clearly." I said, "Yeah, but what's the good of being able to talk clearly if I have no friends to talk to?" So against her advice, I went into regular school. And within 2 weeks, I realized something. A lot of the kids and some of the students will listen to the first 4 or 5 words I would say. If they understood those first 4 or 5 words, they would keep listening. However, if they didn't understand those first words, they would presume my speech was unintelligible and try to fake it. I can always tell when people haven't understood me and try to fake it, because they always have the same 3 things. They smile, they nod, and they go, "Yeah." So I had to figure out a way that I could get the kids and the teachers to understand that they could understand me. So what I did is that when I first talked to someone, I would talk to them in my speech therapy voice. And once I convinced them that they could understand me, I would slowly seduce them into my usual way of talking. So I was doing this day in, day out. I was doing this in the lunchroom, walking home. And then I had to learn how to walk and talk at the same time. So after about a year of being in regular school, I started to meet family friends and relatives who hadn't seen me since I had left the segregated school. And over they came up to me and said, "Norman, what did you do? You're talking so much clearer now." And I would say, "I quit speech therapy." Now, I told that joke at a speech therapist conference in Sioux City, Iowa, and they didn't find that amusing. So, just in case there are any speech therapists in the room today, let me explain. What I learned in speech therapy was important. So don't worry, your life still has meaning. the point of that story is not that speech therapy wasn't important. The point was I needed to have the opportunity to be with other kids first, to then put the ability of what I had learned in speech therapy into practice. So that was an example where my skills really came into being when I had the opportunity first and then could develop the ability. So one of the ways Emma and I like to talk about this is we have a fundamental rule when it comes to segregation. And the rule goes like this. No matter how good of a swimming instructor you are, you cannot teach someone to swim in the parking lot of a swimming pool. And when we segregate kids, and when we focus on ability without opportunity, what we're doing in essence is we're trying to teach kids how to swim out of the environment of water. So when we look at putting disabled kids in regular settings, whether that be, or the charter programs or nursery school or etc., what we're doing is we're not simply being nice to disabled kids. What we're doing is they're putting them in a place where opportunities will foster skills, will foster ability. I want to tell you another story that's happened to me when I was 4 years old. I was born with cerebral palsy. Neither the parents or the professionals had any idea of my cognitive abilities. So when I was 4 years old, the question came up of which school I would go to. In Toronto, there were two distinct school districts. The public school district, which at that time had a new program, which was a school for kids with physical disabilities who could keep up with the regular curriculum. In Toronto, there was another completely separate school district that only provided segregated schools for kids with intellectual disabilities. So the question came out, which school would I go to? Which school district would I attend? And that came down to assessing my cognitive ability. So they brought a psychoeducational assessor in and gave me a standard test. Now, because of my limited ability to talk and my poor fine motor control, I simply couldn't do the puzzles or answer the questions that were being put to me. And in the end, the psychologist was marking down no response, no response, no response. And I was on a water slide in this school for kids with intellectual disabilities. And then she happened to show me the picture that looked like this. A picture of a voyageur scene with a canoe and the people paddling. And like this picture, it was quite faded. And she asked, Norman, what do you see here? And I happened to say the word canoe foggy. And the psychologist nearly fell off her chair because the word canoe in terms of vocabulary was 2 or 3 levels higher than my age. And secondly, because I commented on the context of the photo, it showed that I was not only looking at the context, but the quality of the picture. At that point, the psychologist did something that possibly could have got her fired. She redid the test. And all psychologists know, if you redo a test, that completely invalidates the results. But she did that, and she worked from the assumption that I had the intellectual ability to solve the problems, but lacked either the verbal ability to express it or the fine motor control to show what the answer was. So she did things like this. She would take a puzzle and put it half together and say, Norman, show me the piece that fits here. And my mother says I would bend down and touch the piece of my nose. I would get the piece right every time. Because I said the word canoe and foggy, and because that psychologist gave me the opportunity to redo the test, I went to a school that gave me a regular curriculum, but they gave me the opportunity to go to regular school. So they gave me the opportunity to go into an undergraduate and graduate degree. So the reason that I'm here is not because of an intellectual ability or ability to express myself. It's simply I got lucky. I happened to say the words canoe and foggy, and that radically changed the opportunities that I got. So let me just push this a little bit further. I'd like to put the question out to you. Is it normal for people to have disabilities? Now, most of you probably don't politically correctly decide to say, yes, disability is part of diversity. But I want to push that a bit further. When you think of a person with a disability, usually what most of us believe is that people shouldn't have disabilities. Now, you may be in favor of inclusion, accessibility, disability rights, but you believe when people have a disability, that wasn't the way they were meant to be. So in my case, you might say, Norman, I fully agree with, you have the right to go to regular school and etc. But underneath that, there's the perception that when you were born, something went wrong, so you are not the way you should have been. So when you believe that people should have disabilities, then when you put a ramp in place, what you do is you see that ramp as something to accommodate my mobility impairment. You're doing something for me, and you're locating the disability in my body. Again, you may be fully committed to the idea of ramps being provided, but something being done for me. What happens if we change that initial presumption? What if we begin with the idea that it is inevitable that some people will be disabled? Accidents happen, there are sicknesses, etc. And no matter how much research or medical advancement occurs, there will always be people who have disabilities. As we get older, most of us get disabilities because our bodies break down. So if we understand that disability is an inherent part of the human condition that changes our understanding of accommodation. Because now when we build a ramp, we're not doing something to accommodate the deficiency in that person. We're correcting an architectural error. We're correcting the idea that this building was built on the premise that only non-disabled people would use it. And we're correcting that presumption. Now, this doesn't only apply to physical accommodations. This also applies to kids and students who have cognitive disabilities or learning disabilities. We've built schools and educational programs on the idea that all kids will be normal, that no kids will have learning or cognitive disabilities. So whether it's a ramp, universal design, accommodation to learning, what we're doing is we're not meeting the deficiency of the individual, we're correcting the error in our school system that believes that people shouldn't have disabilities. So what we have understanding this process is it's relocating the problem of disabilities. The wave and taught of the prevailing narrative in our society is that disability is something within me, whereas we start to have to realize that disability is out there in the world. So the problem of disability is not located in me. The problem of disability is a societal problem. It's a pervasive belief that people shouldn't have disabilities. And because of this, disabled people are not given the opportunity to learn the skills and develop in society like non-disabled people.
What I'd like to do now is add a little more complexity to this discussion. Norm talked a lot about opportunity, and of course that's really important, but what I would like to suggest is that opportunity is not enough. Now, in order to unpack that, I want to tell you a couple of stories, and I'm going to start with doing my introduction. And what I'd like to do is start by giving you what I like to call my official story, and I'll bet you have one too. We all do. So this is my official story. This is the story we tell when we're introduced at keynotes or when we go to a cocktail party and someone asks, so what do you do? Tell me about yourself. We all have those stories. Mine goes like this. I started working in community living agencies for people with intellectual disabilities when I was still a teenager. Later, I worked as a preschool teacher and I studied psychology in college. I eventually returned to the community living field and worked in group homes, supported employment, and gradually moved to supervisory roles, managing employment programs, supported preschools and infant development programs, and then finally, I actually became a labor relations specialist and trainer, much to my surprise. When Norm and I met almost 30 years ago, he convinced me to quit the day job and come out on the road with him as a trainer and a speaker. So that's what I've been doing for the last almost 30 years, I guess. During that time, I became certified as a negotiator and a mediator with the Justice Institute of British Columbia, and I worked as a coach and a trainer there for almost 7 years. Then 10 years ago, I went back to school and received a master's degree in conflict management and analysis. Yeah, so that's the official story. Now I want to introduce you to what I like to call my unofficial story. So this is little me, as you can see in these pictures, and little me is the one that looks light sensitive and is always kind of standing a little ways back from everybody, or playing in water, etc. I was, by my own admission, an unusual and intense child. I experienced significant sensory overload, though nobody really used those words at the time. I experienced touch sensitivity, sound sensitivity, sensitivity to smells and tastes, and I needed an inordinate amount of downtime. Lucky for me, although my parents were often bemused and sometimes irritated and certainly exhausted by my intensity, they never tried to change me or tell me that my way of being in the world was wrong. They gave me space to follow my bliss, and indeed, they often facilitated whatever currently engaged my attention. I was allowed to retreat to my room or outside into the forest close to where we lived, free to engage in my many passionate interests, reading, drawing, lining up my farm animals and dolls endlessly. They also saw that water was and still is an important way for me to self-regulate, though nobody used those words in those days either. And they tried to facilitate this in a lot of ways. I was allowed to take long baths and trips to the river, the lake, or the pool. My mother used to joke that she'd finally have to pull me out of the water when I turned blue. In short, my early life at home was happy and supported. But now let's delve a little bit further and talk about my time at school. So it all changed when I entered school. For me, school was an unmitigated nightmare. The characteristics that really just simply bemused and yes, sometimes irritated my family were transformed immediately by educators into personal failings. I became the sad recipient of a lot of adult frustration. My teachers figured that I was pretty smart and that I likely had all the necessary ability to succeed, but they had no idea how to help. Instead, the problems they saw were viewed as something I did on purpose. The labels I collected were not medicalized. Instead, they were descriptions of volitional behavior: lazy, non-compliant, obsessive. So quirkiness was transformed into moral failings. So must try harder, doesn't pay attention, and a variety of other things were part of a constant litany that followed me from my earliest academic experiences. You know, I don't entirely blame educators for this. I was certainly a child who presented really baffling dichotomies. After all, how is an educator to understand a hyperlexic child who's reading in 2 languages by the age of 3 and reading existentialist literature at age 12, but is inexplicably dyscalculic and can't even master the times tables or the simplest mathematical equation? I was seen as inattentive, non-compliant, and ultimately disruptive. I was frustrating to my teachers. I was single-tracked, focused on something and then stuck on that track, often at the expense of getting anything else done. And paradoxically, I was really easily distracted and experienced a real difficulty getting my brain's motivational apparatus in gear if the topic didn't engage me. Do I sound familiar to you, like any of the kids you know? Norm often jokes today that I'm the proverbial light switch. I'm either on or off, there's no in between. So my idiosyncratic and divergent learning style made conventional classroom approaches almost completely inaccessible to me. And my love-hate relationship with the spatial world made physical education an impossible enterprise. This continued until the day that I quit school in demoralized desperation at the age of 15. So I went on actually internalizing and believing those things about myself that I had been told were moral failings. Internalized ableism is a thing, right? I think Hilda Lindemann Nelson calls it doxastic damage, when you take in what other people say about you and you incorporate it into your self-image. It wasn't until later that things began to change for me. And those things changed when Norm and I started a doctoral program. We were looking at therapies, compliance-based therapies and physical therapy, and wondering about what kind of an effect those had on children, and whether sometimes the results of those therapies were unintended, and that sometimes kids would adopt a view of themselves as a result of therapy that they were broken and in need of fixing. So I started reading the work of autistic women and non-binary people, and that was incredibly important for me. So one of the books that I really loved was Nerdy, Shy, and Socially Inappropriate by Cynthia Kim. And I would be reading that book and the hair would stand up on the back of my neck, and I would bring it over to Norm and I'd say, "Look at this." And he'd say, "That sounds just like you." And I started reading other things. So I was reading blogs, and I got connected with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and one of the blogs I particularly loved was The Autistic Hoya by Lydia Brown, and many, many, many others, and I began to see myself reflected there. And ultimately, I began to realize that it wasn't a moral failing, that I was actually an undiagnosed autistic child. And this is harder for girls. I think you probably all know that, because girls tend to fly under the radar, right? We don't get diagnosed as often because we often have different sets of social skills that make us not look the same as the quintessential 8-year-old boy with autism. And, that's something that in autistic circles we laugh about. We say, if you don't look like an 8-year-old boy and line up your toys and have meltdowns in the grocery store and love trains, then you couldn't possibly be autistic. Well, I did line up my toys, and I do love trains. But in any event, I didn't recognize myself, even though I had been working with disabled people my entire adult life, and even some time before that. I didn't recognize myself until I started reading what other autistic women and non-binary people were saying about their experiences, and I saw myself reflected there, and that was a very important moment. So because I was undiagnosed and largely flew under the radar, my experience was different from norms. I was never denied access to the classroom. It was never suggested to me that segregation was appropriate or that I should take part in any remedial programs. In fact, there weren't any remedial programs in the schools I attended. Arguably, I had experienced all the opportunity I could wish for, but the problem was I lacked support. Because nobody understood that I was experiencing the classroom, and in fact the world, differently, and coping with a laundry list of sensory and learning issues, I was largely ignored or treated with disdain and frustration. It's undeniably true that opportunity must precede ability, but unfortunately, opportunity without support is a setup for failure. So my experience was best encapsulated by the immortal words of Pogo. If any of you are old enough to remember Pogo, I was surrounded by insurmountable opportunity. So opportunity is not enough. So in Norm's early years, he was stuck in the parking lot. He talked about that earlier. And teachers with the best of intentions could not possibly replicate the nuances of typical experiences that he needed to know about through some fabricated life skills education. It was only after leaving the segregated school and being out in the community that he was able to learn the more complex issues of human interaction and the skills he'd need to be successful. Now me, I wasn't in the parking lot. I was in the pool, but I spent most of my time drowning. So you might be asking, well, what might have been helpful for you? Well, the first thing that might have been really important is listening. Now, you might say, well, we're dealing with preschool kids, and sometimes they can't articulate stuff, and that's true, and I'm sure all of you know that we have to listen in different ways. And some people don't speak at all. Some of us who are autistic experience episodic language. So, sometimes these are more difficult. So sometimes the way in which kids will tell us things don't come neatly packaged, and we actually have to play detective and decode them, and I think you know that. One story that I like came from a friend of ours who was an itinerant teacher, art teacher, and she was working with a little boy one day who drew a disturbing picture. He drew a picture of a house, and he used a lot of black wax crayon, and out of the chimney of the house there was a lot of black smoke in that very, very thick, dark crayon. And there was a little figure, little stick figure, also coming out. And Susan said, "What's that?" And he said, "My dad just blew up." Now, I think for a lot of us that would ring alarm bells, right? And it did for Susan and for the teacher. So they went and they did a little digging, and they found out that in fact it was not abuse. The father had left the home very recently, and that was his way of showing what he felt about that. So we sometimes have to find unusual ways to listen to kids, different ways. So the next thing, and this is I've borrowed from our friend Nick Walker, who is also autistic and a professor down there in California where you are. And Nick says, trust the weirdness. He says, there's so much remediation going on for little kids. Parents feel like they have to do it. People feel like they have to do it in preschools, in schools, etc. Like, weed out that weirdness. And he says, that's a mistake, because that, again, in that same way of doxastic damage, it can implant an identity of deficiency in a child. He says, let kids play around with figuring out how their bodies and brains work. That's what worked best for me with my parents. They did that. They didn't try to change me or fix me. They just kind of went, okay, let's support what she wants to do in whatever way she wants to do it. Does that mean I didn't need to learn some things? Gain some social skills? No, of course those things would have been helpful, but context is everything, and how that happens is really, really critical. The next thing would have been acknowledgement. People sometimes ask me, well, would it have helped you to know that you were autistic as a kid? In some ways, I think it would have. It really would have, because then I would not have internalized all those negative things about myself. I would have been able to say, no, this is just a different way of being in the world. But here's the rub. What I see happening a lot for little kids nowadays is that they get immersed into compliance-based therapies at a very, very early age. And what I know from my adult friends who are now young women, men, non-binary people who have been through those compliance-based, through that kind of compliance-based therapy, is that many of them are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of it. And I think we have to think about what happens when we encourage kids to not use the ways they have to self-regulate and to cope with the world. So telling a kid to have quiet hands can be really quite damaging. And all of the ridiculous things that we sometimes ask children to do. Julia Bascom, who's the executive director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, said that when she was little, they used to glue her hands to the table. I don't think people do stuff like that anymore. At least I would really hope they don't. But at the same time, hand flapping, spinning, all of those things that we use to kind of manage our sensory world are often things that people try to eradicate. So I'm glad I didn't experience that, because I see the effects on adult people and I hear what they're saying. The next thing is presuming that students, when they're disruptive, are struggling. They're not being resistant. One of the things about autism that often frustrates teachers and others is that it seems like one day a child will know how to do something and then the next day they won't. Only that's often interpreted as, well, you did it yesterday. Are you just being difficult or obtuse? No, this is really a common thing for a lot of kids with different learning disabilities, including autism. So presume that students are struggling and not resistant. When it comes to rethinking disruption, I always like to think of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who once said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And I think that's just as true for kids as for adults. So our friend and colleague Bill Page also uses a swimming analogy. He says, never give swimming lessons when someone is drowning. So just being in the pool isn't enough either. Opportunity has to be accompanied by support. And sometimes that support is about fostering learning, but sometimes it's simply about providing safety. Bill reminds us that educators and parents have two roles. He says that of the swimming instructor and that of the lifeguard. He suggests that we get into trouble when we don't understand which role we need to assume at which time. When I was drowning, it was not helpful for the teacher to be a swimming instructor, yelling directions from the metaphorical pool deck. What I needed was someone who was a lifeguard, someone to get into the pool with me and help me get to shallow water. And then later, after the overwhelm had dissipated and I was ready to engage, then to help me learn the skills that I needed. I did my master's thesis about 10 years ago, and I did it on de-escalation because the whole issue of disruption has always been very, very interesting to me, partly because I was a disruptive kid, but also because I've worked with a lot of people who protest their lives through disruption. And so what I did was I went sideways, and I decided that I was going to interview people who dealt with the most difficult situations that we could imagine. So I went to hostage negotiators and I interviewed hostage negotiators all over North America about the relational and communication-based approaches that they use to help very, very upset people de-escalate. It's a fascinating year of research. Eventually, I took this thesis and turned it into a book, and that's a commercial, just in case you're wondering. But it really made me think about how we see people who are disruptive. And one of the things I learned from the hostage negotiators that I think was the most important thing was that they changed the way they saw people. They changed the narrative that they held about who the person who was being disruptive actually was. So you and I might look at a hostage situation and say, who's that jerk in the bank with a sawed-off shotgun and 3 hostages? And we'd say, you know, there's no way you can be relational and communication-based with a person doing that. And if you're like me, you probably saw negotiation through the lens of television, which tells you that it's all about SWAT team and smoke bombs and throw phones and all of that stuff. What I learned from negotiators is that actually it all had to do with communication. And the first thing that a negotiator will say when they come on the scene of a hostage taking or a suicide attempt is, so how do we get here today? And then they get genuinely curious. And they change the narrative. Over and over and over, they told me, you cannot let judgment creep in when you're thinking about a person. What you have to do instead is change the way you see that person to just a person in a bad place and start there. Because if you let your judgments in, they said, it leaks into the conversation. And they told me stories about negotiations that had derailed because somebody had let judgment creep in. So that I found very, very interesting. And the way that I began to posit it was like this. So one narrative, and a typical narrative when we have a disruptive student, is smarten up. And that is a narrative of correction. But negotiators would never do that. Instead, they say, what's up? And that's a narrative of curiosity. Other people like Ross Greene, you may have read Ross Greene's book, The Explosive Child or Lost at School. He talks about this question too. And we think it's a really important question to ask. What's up? I want to tell you a little story. This is a story that happened to us when we were working for a school district a few years back. One of the things that Norm sometimes does is school assemblies. And in this instance, we were doing a school assembly and a presentation and then a parent and community presentation in the evening. So Norm did his usual assembly presentation to these, 2nd through 5th grade kids, I guess. And it was great. It went well. And as we were leaving the auditorium, we were walking down the hall with the principal. And there was a little boy, really maybe 5, 6, something like. And he's walking down the hall with a teacher. And the principal says, Jorge, come over here for a minute. She says, I want you to meet Mr. Norman. And so she says, now, you just heard Mr. Norman talk. And, you haven't been doing very well at school at all, have you? And he his head is down and he nods, says, yeah. And she says, now you saw that Mr. Norman has been through some difficult things and you see where he's gone. Now, that wasn't exactly the message Norm was trying to make, but anyway. So Norm and I think Jorge, were feeling a little uncomfortable, but she carried on and she said, now you can do better, right? And Jorge nodded with his head down, yes, I can do better. So off he went. We then went to the library where we were doing a presentation with teachers. And I presented the material from my thesis and talked about the difference between a narrative of smarten up and what's up. And then a few hours later, we came back into the library where the community presentation was being set up. And the principal came rushing in and she was crying. And I thought, uh-oh, this can't be good. And so she said, no, it's okay. I thought about what you said, and I went and found Jorge. And she said, I sat him down, and I said, so Jorge, what's up? And she said, and he told me. He said that his parents had split up a few weeks ago, and last week his mom came back and told the kids that she was going away forever and she would not be seeing them anymore. He says, now I just sit in my seat and I look at the wall and think about how I'm not going to see my mommy. And she said, I thought I was doing really good work with kids and that I was asking them. But she says I wasn't really asking the right questions. And sometimes I wasn't asking any questions at all. I was just telling them how to, straighten up and fly right. And she said, but hey, it gets better. She says, one of my teachers came in and she'd been struggling with this student all year. And she was so frustrated. She came into my office and I said to her, look, just go down there, get the student, sit down and ask him what's up. About 20 minutes later, the teacher came back and she was crying. And she said, this kid told me about his life, about how his father picks him up by the ear and throws him around and what happens out in his neighborhood. And she said, he's growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in. He's living my life. So again, the principal said, there's such power in that question. What's up? And it's a question I think we always need to start with, like the hostage negotiators. So how do we get here today? And then just listen. Kids need that more than anything, right? I think we know that. I think the lights had also gone on for me a number of years ago when I first started training as a mediator. I'd been working in human service organizations where we were expected to have the answers to everything. We didn't always, but we were expected to. And when I started training as a mediator, I was surprised and delighted to find that I was not expected to have any answers at all. In fact, what I needed most was questions. And that's what you do in mediation, right? You learn how to ask questions. And the thing that, people talked about powerful questions. And at first I was really intimidated by that. Like, what's a powerful question? But I learned about that too, that those are often the short and easy questions. Once heard Larry King interviewed by a radio personality here in Canada after he'd written his book. And the interviewer said, your friends in this book say that you ask really dumb questions. What do you make of that? And Larry King says, yeah, I do. He says, it's true, because when I started out in my career as an interviewer, I used to hear other interviewers ask a question on TV and then spend the next 10 minutes giving their opinion, and then when there were about 2 minutes left in the program, they would ask the guest for their opinion. He said, I vowed I would never be like that. And he says, so now I just sit there and I say things like, so what happened then? And what happened after that? Really? And he says, and people tell me stuff. So in my mind, one of the best examples of a powerful question is, what's up? Or how'd we get here today? But the point after that is to just sit and listen. So in our book, at the risk of being solipsistic or doing another commercial, this is what we've said. Although improving ability may make a person's life easier in some respects, it probably won't make their life better. The significant obstacles confronting us are the lack of opportunities, not the limitations of ability. And in that context, we also need to think about the kind of support we offer in order to ensure that people leave school, preschool, whatever kind of school, with a sense of confidence, competence, and optimism. So to summarize then, as disabled people, we believe that it is both essential and ethical that disabled kids are offered the same opportunity as their non-disabled peers. Focusing on ability to the exclusion of opportunity is not only fundamentally unjust, it ironically undermines the very conditions needed to acquire those abilities. And yet, it is equally important that those opportunities be accompanied by support, and that educators take the time to work with the student to determine what kind of support will be most helpful. So going back to that slide that we put up at the very beginning, we believe that it's important not to fall into the trap of looking for those keys where the light is best. And sometimes the place where we need to go to look for those keys is with the individual themselves, to ask the kid, ask the family, and connect with them. So where are you looking? Where are you looking for those keys? So I want to close with a little story that comes from the Lakota Sioux. And the story goes like this. An elder brought his tribe together one day, and he said, "Inside of us there are two dogs, and they're always fighting. The two dogs are Mean and Happy. And he asked the members of his tribe, which dog do you think will win? And he suggested that they go away, think about it, and talk about it, and that they should come back the next day and they could discuss. So the next day, members of his group came back, and some of them said that Happy would win, and others said, nah, you're being naive. Mean will always win. And the elders said, you're both wrong. The dog that will win is the dog that you feed the most. So we like to conceptualize these two dogs as ability and opportunity, and ask ourselves, which dog are we going to focus on? Which dog are we going to feed? Are we going to focus strictly on ability with the belief that that ability will translate later into opportunity? Or are we going to start with opportunity and let ability come from there?
So to conclude, what we'd like to do is offer you some key points to remember some of the ideas that we offered to you throughout this presentation. So, firstly, ability doesn't precede opportunity. Opportunity precedes ability. Social convention, not ability, determines opportunity. Remember, I learned to speak clearly when I quit speech therapy. You can't teach someone to swim in the parking lot of a swimming pool.
And remember, opportunity is not enough. Support is also needed. And never give swimming lessons when someone is drowning. Remember that questions are more important than answers. And don't forget to ask what's up rather than demanding that a person smarten up. Innovation delivers what rehabilitation promises. And finally, ask yourself, which dog do we feed? Do we focus on ability or do we focus on opportunity? Both are important, but opportunity needs to come before ability. So we'll sign off, and we really hope this has been useful for you. So good luck.
And stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.